What if I told you that long before the Knights Templar, long before the Crusades, long before the castles and banners we usually imagine when we think of the Middle Ages, there was another dynasty? A dynasty that quietly shaped the course of Europe. A dynasty whose name lingers faintly in old chronicles, but rarely in our memory today. The Merovingians. Forgotten kings, semi-legendary ancestors, mysterious rituals, and a dynasty that spanned 3 centuries, ruling from the ashes of Rome into the early medieval world. Welcome back, dear listeners. To those of you who return each evening, welcome again to our quiet corner of history. And to those who have just discovered this channel, welcome for the first time. You are in the right place if you want to drift slowly into the past, listening to stories that are calm, precise, and perhaps a little strange. This is boring history for sleep, where even the dustiest chapters of history become the soft ground on which we rest our thoughts. Tonight, we begin with the Merovingians. We must begin slowly, with patience, because the Merovingians are not easy to place in the imagination. They are not as familiar as the Romans, nor as dramatic as the Vikings, nor as grand as Charlemagne and the empire he would later rule. The Merovingians stand instead in the long shadow between worlds, between the Roman Empire and the medieval kingdoms that grew after its collapse. Their story begins in fragments. The name itself comes from a half-legendary figure, Merovec. He is described as a chieftain, perhaps ruling in the mid-5th century, a time when the Roman Empire in the West was collapsing under its own weight. The exact truth of his existence is unclear. Some chronicles say he was born of the sea, a mythic story where his mother encountered a sea creature and conceived him. Others describe him simply as a leader of the Franks, a Germanic people who had long pressed against the Roman frontier. From Merovec comes the dynasty's name, the Merovingians. His descendants became the kings of the Franks, ruling much of Gaul, the region we now know as France and parts of Belgium, Luxembourg, Western Germany, and Switzerland. Imagine the world in which they rose. Rome had been the central power of Europe for centuries, but by the 400s, it was breaking apart. The Western Empire had no strong armies left to defend its borders. The city of Rome itself had been sacked. Old structures of law, taxation, and roads still existed, but in fragments. It was a world of transition. In this space, smaller kingdoms grew. The Visigoths held Spain. The Burgundians controlled valleys of the Rhone. And in northern Gaul, the Franks began to rise under the Merovingian line. The first great king of this dynasty, remembered clearly in history, was Clovis I. He reigned from 481 to 511. He united many Frankish tribes under one rule, expanded territory through war, and most importantly, converted to Christianity. This act, more than any conquest, set the tone for centuries of Frankish power. By becoming Christian, specifically aligned with the Roman Catholic Church, Clovis linked his dynasty with the spiritual authority that remained strong even as the empire itself dissolved. But before we move too fast, let us stay a moment in the slow emergence of the dynasty. Imagine Gaul in the late 5th century. Roman villas stood abandoned. Roads that had once carried legions now carried small groups of travelers or monks moving between monasteries. Cities like Paris, Tours, and Reims were still inhabited, but they no longer resembled the bustling centers of Roman administration. Instead, they were quieter, smaller, places of refuge more than of empire. In this changing world, Merovingian rulers were at once kings and warlords. They ruled not from marble palaces, but from wooden halls. Their wealth came not from a central treasury, but from land, tribute, and plunder. They wore long hair as a symbol of their royal authority. This detail, the long hair of Merovingian kings, became almost sacred. To cut it was to strip them of power. This curious tradition reveals how much of their authority still relied on ancient, almost magical, symbols rather than bureaucratic structures. The Merovingians, then, were a dynasty of transition. They stood at the meeting point of fading Rome and emerging medieval Christendom. Their courts combined Roman law with Frankish custom. Bishops advised their kings, yet warriors remained their foundation. Their queens were often politically powerful, shaping alliances through marriage and intrigue. And through it all, the dynasty prepared the ground for what would come next. The rise of the Carolingians, the family that would eventually produce Charlemagne, the emperor who remade Europe. Yet tonight, we linger with the Merovingians themselves, because they are too often overlooked. Their names, Merovec, Clovis, Clother, Dagobert, do not roll off the tongue easily for modern listeners. Their kingdoms were often divided among heirs, leading to tangled maps of overlapping rule. Their stories are not always neat, and yet it was precisely through this uneven, complicated dynasty that Europe was shaped. They reigned from roughly the 5th century to the middle of the 8th, almost 300 years. That is longer than the United States has existed as a nation, yet we rarely think of them. Instead, our minds leap from the fall of Rome to Charlemagne, skipping over the slow centuries in between. But those centuries were filled with their rule, their rituals, and their quiet foundations. The Merovingians remind us that history is not built only on famous names and sudden changes. Sometimes history is slow. It is made of generations who keep the structure intact, even if they are not celebrated in later stories. It is made of kings whose palaces were not monumental, but whose decisions shaped the survival of peoples and languages. It is made of dynasties that appear almost ordinary until we realize how long they endured. So, who were the Merovingians? They were the first line of Frankish kings after the fall of Rome. They were semi-legendary in their origins, practical in their rule, symbolic in their authority. They were the keepers of Europe's fragile bridge between antiquity and the medieval world. And as we will see in the parts that follow, they carried secrets, traditions, and buried legacies that echoed far beyond their time. The Merovingians rose at a time when Europe was in quiet collapse. The Roman Empire, which had once covered much of the known world, was no longer what it had been. Its legions, those steady-footed soldiers of iron discipline, were fewer. Its roads, once the smooth arteries of trade and power, were cracked, overgrown, and in many places sinking back into the soil. Cities that had echoed with merchants and senators were quieter now, their stone forums partly abandoned, their baths cooling and empty, their mosaics slowly flaking into dust. Into this slow unraveling stepped new rulers, figures who did not carry the grandeur of Rome, yet who inherited its bones. Among them were the Merovingians. To understand their strange, half-shadowed importance, one must picture the stage they walked upon, the land that had been Rome's Gaul. Gaul was a vast territory. To the north lay forests, damp and thick with oak, where mist clung to branches and wolves still wandered. To the south stretched the old Roman towns, Lugdunum, now Lyon, still busy but quieter than before. Narbo, today's Narbonne, with its fading markets, and Arlate, modern Alls, its amphitheater crumbling but still used. In between ran the rivers, the Seine, the Loire, the Rhone, and above all the wide, slow Rhine, the old frontier of empire. Rome had once ruled Gaul with precision. Governors collected taxes, roads carried grain, amphitheaters rang with games. Now, in the 5th century, the edges of this order had frayed. Villas crumbled, aqueducts carried less water, and many townsfolk turned back to farming, returning to the soil because the cities no longer promised safety. It was in this environment that the Franks moved. The Franks were not strangers to Gaul. They had lived along the Rhine frontier for generations, first as enemies, then as uneasy allies of Rome. The Romans had sometimes paid them in gold, sometimes in land, to keep other tribes at bay. Over time, these payments became habits, and the Franks grew stronger while Rome weakened. Among the Franks, a dynasty began to form, a line of rulers who would come to be called the Merovingians. Their name comes from a shadowy ancestor, Merovec, a half-legendary chieftain said to have lived in the mid-5th century. His story is blurred, told only in fragments. Some said he was the son of a sea creature, conceived when his mother was touched by something that rose from the waters. Whether true or not, such tales set the tone. The Merovingians were not just rulers. They were something stranger, figures wrapped in an air of destiny and myth. When the Roman Empire in the West finally fell, when the last emperor was deposed in 476, the Merovingians were already poised to step into the vacuum. They did not immediately claim all power, for Rome's structures lingered. Roman bishops, Roman laws, Roman traditions still shaped daily life. But the Merovingians began to plant themselves firmly in this crumbling soil. They gathered support among warriors, secured oaths from nobles, and gradually extended their control over the land that had once been Rome's richest province. It is easy to forget how fragile things were. Imagine walking through a town in Gaul around the year 500. The streets are still paved with Roman stone, but weeds push through the cracks. A forum that once rang with speeches now serves as a market, its columns chipped and worn. The air smells of wood smoke, not incense. A bishop preaches in the church, reminding the people that God protects them, while outside a Merovingian noble sits astride a horse, his long hair flowing, his spear polished, his retinue gathered around him. Two worlds overlap. The memory of Rome and the presence of new rulers who barely know Latin, yet who command respect through arms and ancestry. This overlap was crucial. The Merovingians were not Romans, yet they ruled on Roman ground. They borrowed what they could: Roman taxes, Roman scribes, Roman laws. At the same time, they ruled as Franks, through kinship, through the loyalty of warriors, through land divided among heirs. This duality gave them power, but also instability. For centuries, Europe would live in this twilight, half Roman, half new, trying to preserve order while slowly inventing something different. We rarely think of this slow merging. When we imagine the fall of Rome, we picture collapse, sudden and total. But for the people who lived through it, life went on. They still baked bread, still fetched water, still tilled fields, still whispered about omens in the night sky. Only gradually did they realize that the empire was gone, and that new dynasties, like the Merovingians, were shaping the world to come. To lie in bed and imagine it is to see a dim light fading, replaced not by darkness, but by something quieter, earthier, less polished. The Merovingians inherited the ruins of a giant and slowly made them their own. They did not erase Rome, but lived among its ghosts, borrowing stones from Roman walls to build new halls, listening to Latin prayers while speaking their own Frankish tongue at home. Their rule, beginning in this shadowed age, was not just political. It was symbolic. They stood as proof that after Rome, power did not vanish. It shifted. And though history often rushes to Charlemagne or to later medieval kings, one must pause here, with the Merovingians, to see the first roots of medieval Europe pushing through Rome's crumbled floor. The Merovingians were not simply rulers of men. They were, in many ways, rulers of memory itself. Their story begins, of course, with a figure whose name echoes faintly in the corridors of history, Merovec. He was a man whose life existed somewhere between fact and legend, a shadowy ancestor whose presence shaped centuries without ever fully revealing itself. The chronicles describe him as a chieftain of the Franks in the 5th century, but that is only part of the tale. For Merovec's origin is steeped in mystery. According to the legends preserved by later monks and scribes, Merovec's mother conceived him under circumstances that were anything but ordinary. Some accounts claim that she encountered a being rising from the sea, a creature neither fully human nor beast, whose essence touched the waters and infused the child she bore. Others suggest that this story is symbolic, a way to convey that the Merovingians carried with them a kind of otherworldly authority, a mandate beyond the realm of mere mortal kings. The sea-born king, half shadow, half flesh, would become the foundation of a dynasty whose influence stretched across 3 centuries. As you imagine Merovec, picture him standing at the edge of the forested Rhine, waves breaking gently along the shore, his long hair blowing in the wind, a figure simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary. The people around him, the early Franks, farmers, hunters, and warriors, might have viewed him with awe, wondering if the stories of his conception were true, or if they were simply reflections of something intangible that they felt but could not name. The air would have smelled of damp earth and salt water, the cries of gulls mingling with the clatter of village life. And amidst this world of mist and river, Merovec carried the weight of a dynasty yet to be born. The most striking feature of the Merovingians, for both contemporaries and later historians, was their long hair. This was no mere ornament. The hair of a Merovingian king was a living symbol of power, a visible sign of sacred legitimacy. To cut it was to strip away authority, reducing a ruler to an ordinary man, powerless to command armies or to be acknowledged as sovereign. This tradition persisted throughout the dynasty. Kings were often depicted with hair flowing down their backs, heavy with oils or combed carefully, shining under torchlight in wooden halls where banners swayed above. In this way, hair became a language, a statement of identity, a visible bond between ruler and people, a signal that the blood of Merovec still ran strong. Consider the slow rhythm of daily life under these kings. In the early mornings, when mist still clung to the valleys and dew coated the forest floor, warriors might gather at the wooden halls of their king. Horses stamped in the yard. Spears rested against walls carved with Frankish patterns. The smell of wet wood mingled with the faint tang of iron from weapons, the aroma of porridge from the hearth drifting out to mingle with the cold air. The Merovingian king, seated upon a low throne or raised platform, would receive petitions, advise councils, or simply observe the flow of his household. Each action, each gesture, was imbued with symbolic meaning. The dynasty expanded through conquest, negotiation, and marriage. Clovis I, the most famous early Merovingian, united the Frankish tribes into a single kingdom. His reign, beginning in 481, marked a turning point. Clovis conquered neighboring peoples, secured the loyalty of pagan and Christian alike, and eventually converted to Christianity, a decision whose ripples would shape Europe for centuries. By aligning with the Roman Church, Clovis not only strengthened his political position but also added spiritual authority to his already potent hereditary claims. Through him, the Merovingians became not just warriors but sanctioned rulers, their legitimacy intertwined with both blood and faith. Yet even as power expanded, the dynasty's reputation became complex. Chronicles portray some kings as indulgent, their courts lavish and sometimes disorderly. They were accused of letting ministers and advisors run the day-to-day affairs, while they enjoyed banquets, hunts, and ceremonies. And yet, even in these accounts, the aura of the dynasty endured. A Merovingian king might be criticized for indulgence, yet the people and nobles alike recognized that the sacred blood of Merovec still flowed through his veins. Even idle kings carried weight because their very presence spoke of legitimacy and continuity. To live in a Merovingian kingdom was to exist in a delicate balance between myth and reality, order and chaos. Villages spread across the valleys and hills, fields tilled by hands hardened by labor, rivers flowing under broken Roman bridges, forests dark and thick, filled with the noises of birds, wolves, and the occasional traveler moving cautiously at night. The smell of wood smoke and baked bread mixed with the damp earth. In these surroundings, the kings moved among their people, distant yet visible, long-haired yet approachable, a living symbol of authority that stretched beyond the ordinary. And then there were the hidden aspects of the dynasty. Beyond the visible rituals, the long hair, the Christian ceremonies, there were stories whispered quietly, secrets carried in royal treasuries, mysterious alliances, sacred relics, and perhaps knowledge lost even to the scribes who recorded their deeds. Some later legends suggested that these hidden elements, preserved by the Merovingians, eventually reached the Templars centuries later. What exactly was passed down remains unknown, and the mystery adds to the aura that surrounds the dynasty. As you lie quietly, imagining these ancient halls, the kings seated among their nobles, the long-haired rulers looking out across forests and rivers, you may notice how slowly, deliberately, history unfolds. It is not in battles alone, not in sudden victories, that the world changes. It is in dynasties like the Merovingians, enduring quietly for centuries, shaping the land, guiding the people, preserving secrets, and slowly preparing the stage for all that was to come. Their reign lasted roughly 300 years, from the first whispers of Merovec to the gradual rise of the Carolingians in the mid-8th century. In that time, Europe shifted from the remnants of Rome to something recognizably medieval. Through wars, marriages, religious reforms, and the slow construction of legal traditions, the Merovingians left traces that, while subtle, would endure for generations. Their dynasty is a reminder that history is often built in silence, in ritual, in continuity rather than spectacle. Even today, when we study medieval Europe, the Merovingians are often overlooked. Yet they stand as a bridge between the ancient world and the medieval one, a dynasty of mystery, sacred symbols, and long shadows. Their stories, partially lost, partially mythic, invite us to pause, to breathe, and to imagine a time when king's hair was power, when legends were law, and when the foundations of Europe were quietly laid in the forests and fields of Gaul. To understand the Merovingians, it is not enough to speak of kings, legends, or long hair. One must also enter the world they ruled, the lands, the villages, the forests, and the routines of everyday life. Because while kings carried power and myth, it was the slow rhythm of ordinary life that shaped their dynasty. And it is this rhythm we will follow now. Imagine the landscape of 5th and 6th century Gaul. Rolling hills stretch to the horizon, dotted with dense forests where mist gathers in the early morning. Rivers snake through valleys, their surfaces gleaming in the weak light of dawn. In these forests, you might hear the faint rustle of deer, the sharp cry of birds, and, sometimes, the footsteps of travelers moving cautiously along dirt tracks. The roads themselves are partly Roman, partly reclaimed by nature. Paved stones cracked and uneven, moss creeping through the crevices. These roads carry peasants, merchants, and occasional nobles on horseback, moving from village to town, from market to monastery, guided by the rhythm of days and seasons. Villages under the Merovingians are small, clustered, and often surrounded by wooden palisades. Each home is built of timber, with thatched roofs and simple interiors. Smoke curls lazily from chimneys, carrying the smell of wood and cooking over the fields. You can imagine the sound of pigs rooting in the mud, chickens clucking, and the low murmur of children at play. In some homes, clay or wooden bowls hold porridge, bread, or vegetables grown in small garden plots. Life is slow, measured, grounded in survival, work, and the subtle passage of time. The Merovingian kings, in contrast, live in halls that are larger but still rustic by later standards. Wooden beams stretch overhead, supporting roofs that let in the light through narrow windows or open spaces. The floor is earth or pressed clay, sometimes covered with animal skins or woven mats. Fires burn constantly, not only for warmth, but for cooking and light. The smell of burning wood mingles with that of roasted meats and fresh bread. Nobles gather, seated on benches, observing rituals and ceremonies, while the king's advisors, both secular and clerical, confer in low voices. Even in these halls, the influence of Rome lingers. Some nobles speak Latin, some carry Roman titles, and laws are still based partly on Roman customs. But the world has changed. One of the most striking features of life under the Merovingians is its ritualized calm. From dawn to dusk, patterns repeat. The ringing of church bells, the morning gathering of warriors, the midday meal with simple bread, cheese, and ale, the tending of fields, the preparation of livestock for market or slaughter. These routines are not dramatic, but they are enduring. They give shape to the days and, in doing so, support the authority of kings. Power is exercised slowly, in observation, in ceremony, in the careful distribution of gifts, lands, and favors. Children are part of this rhythm, learning by watching, helping with chores, running along dirt paths that lead to streams or past hedges where wild berries grow. They hear stories of Merovec and his descendants, told quietly in the evenings, under the light of lamps or fires, voices low and deliberate. These stories may mix fact and legend, but their purpose is to root the young in the world of the Merovingians, to make them feel that the dynasty's presence is natural, eternal, and protective. Religious life is deeply intertwined with everyday existence. Christianity, which the Merovingians embraced, spreads through monasteries, abbeys, and simple churches scattered across the landscape. Monks copy texts slowly, their hands stained with ink, their voices chanting prayers in low, measured tones. Even in small villages, a priest may offer counsel, bless a field, or speak of divine protection. The rhythm of prayer is mirrored by the rhythm of labor. The day is divided not only by the sun, but by the sacred hours, by the repetition of familiar words, by the cadence of rituals that reinforce the dynasty's authority and the continuity of life itself. Beyond the villages, the forests and rivers hold their own slow, constant drama. Hunters track deer or boar, silently moving through undergrowth thick with moss and leaf litter. Wolves roam, their cries echoing at night, a reminder of the wild, untamed world beyond the cultivated fields. Travelers on horseback pass cautiously, wary of bandits or hostile tribes, guided only by the sun, stars, and the vague remains of Roman road networks. This is the world that the Merovingians rule over, a mixture of cultivated land, quiet towns, and the persistent presence of nature, all unfolding at a deliberate pace. The Merovingian court mirrors these rhythms, but magnifies them. Each action is purposeful, even when it seems leisurely. The king receives visitors, hears petitions, observes ceremonies, and moves through rituals that demonstrate continuity and legitimacy. Meals are shared slowly, with bread broken by hand, meat carved carefully, ale poured into wooden or clay cups. The presence of the king is both ordinary and extraordinary. He eats, drinks, and speaks as a man, yet his long hair, his lineage, and his symbolic actions mark him as someone other. Even the governance of the Merovingian kingdoms unfolds in measured ways. Laws are passed not abruptly, but gradually. Decisions filtered through nobles and clerics. Land is distributed carefully, not always fairly, yet according to patterns that will endure. Alliances are cemented in silence as much as in open agreements. There is no need for dramatic battles at every turn. The persistence of authority lies in continuity, in the invisible threads connecting king, noble, peasant, and monk. Imagine walking along a Merovingian road in the late afternoon. The sun is low, casting long shadows across the fields. You hear the murmur of a nearby stream, the distant call of a horn from a hunting party, the laughter of children returning from the forest. Smoke curls from chimneys, carrying the scent of evening meals. Somewhere, a monk chants softly, his voice carried on the wind. The Merovingian king rides slowly along the road, hair long and flowing, spear at his side, observing his realm. All around, life unfolds quietly, yet the sense of structure, of order, of slow power is unmistakable. Even in moments of apparent stillness, there are lessons to be learned. The slow, repetitive patterns of daily life reinforce the authority of kings. The careful balance of village, court, and monastery creates a network of interdependence. Every field tilled, every meal shared, every prayer whispered contributes to the enduring presence of the Merovingians. The dynasty's power is not always dramatic. It is often quiet, subtle, persistent, like the river that slowly shapes the valley or the wind that wears down stone over centuries. By the 8th century, these rhythms, these practices, and these subtle forms of power had woven a world that felt stable, even if it was still fragile. The Merovingians had ruled for nearly 3 centuries, leaving their mark in forests, fields, villages, and towns. Their legend persisted alongside their governance, a reminder that history is built not only by events, but by continuity, by habit, by slow and deliberate action that endures long after individual lives have passed. Even though the Merovingians are often remembered for their long hair, their mysterious origins, and the quiet rituals of daily life, their world was not entirely calm. Beyond the villages, the forests, and the misty rivers, the kingdoms of the Merovingians were forged and maintained through a mixture of alliances, careful diplomacy, and occasional battles. These were not always large-scale wars, though sometimes they were. Often, they were subtle contests of loyalty, influence, and survival. To truly understand the dynasty, one must move slowly through this world, imagining the rhythm of preparation, movement, and cautious negotiation. Picture a Merovingian king seated on a low wooden throne in the great hall of his palace. Outside, the sun is just rising, filtering through the narrow windows, casting soft, golden light across the polished wooden floor. His advisors and nobles gather quietly, speaking in low tones, carrying messages from distant allies or reports of unrest in the provinces. Perhaps a small army of mounted warriors waits beyond the palisade, their horses stamping in anticipation. The king listens carefully, nods slightly, and issues measured instructions. Each movement, each word, is deliberate, shaping alliances and asserting authority. The Franks themselves were not a single, unified people. Tribes, clans, and families had their own loyalties and territories. The king's power was never absolute. It depended on the consent of these leaders. To maintain cohesion, the Merovingians cultivated relationships through marriages, the granting of land, and ceremonial gifts. These practices may seem ordinary, but in a world without modern communication or centralized authority, they were essential. A misstep, a slight insult, or a broken promise could unravel months of careful diplomacy. At times, diplomacy failed, and violence became necessary. Battles under the Merovingians were often slow, deliberate affairs. Armies were smaller than those of Rome, yet no less significant to the people involved. Warriors wore helmets and carried shields, their spears and swords reflecting the dim light of morning. Horses raised dust along the dirt roads, and banners swayed gently in the wind. There was an almost ritualistic quality to the preparation. Horses were fed and groomed, weapons checked and polished, and soldiers assembled in precise formations. The clash of combat was intense, yet brief. Once the battle ended, the survivors tended to the wounded and repaired the land. Even outside of actual combat, the threat of war shaped life. Villagers fortified homes, stocked granaries, and learned to recognize the signs of movement in the forests. Children played war games that mimicked the adult world, learning early the importance of loyalty, strategy, and caution. Monks in monasteries prayed for the safety of both king and people, chanting in low, measured tones that mingled with the distant sounds of clanging swords or the neighing of horses. All these details created a world in which tension and routine coexisted, where preparation and vigilance were part of the slow rhythm of life. The Merovingian kings also relied on religious authority to strengthen their fragile power. Conversion to Christianity was more than a personal choice. It was a political act. Clovis's baptism, for instance, was a turning point. By aligning himself with the Roman Church, he gained not only spiritual legitimacy, but also a network of allies across former Roman lands. Monks, priests, and bishops became intermediaries between king and people, spreading the idea that the Merovingians ruled by divine sanction. In quiet, repetitive ways, through blessings, processions, and rituals, the church reinforced the slow, patient power of the dynasty. Yet the power of the Merovingians was never secure. Civil wars erupted periodically as heirs fought over lands and titles. Rival factions within the family could divide kingdoms, sending some princes to monasteries while others claimed thrones through force. Even within a single household, tensions simmered. Long-haired kings, queens, and nobles navigating alliances, grudges, and ambitions. The calm rhythm of daily life existed alongside this potential for sudden upheaval, creating a tension that was both subtle and persistent. The landscape itself played a role in the fragility of power. Forests could hide raiders, rivers could flood, and harsh winters could starve armies and peasants alike. Roads, often remnants of the Roman Empire, were uneven and overgrown. Communication was slow. A message that took hours to deliver could change meaning along the way. Kings had to anticipate these factors, using patience and strategy rather than relying solely on force. Their long hair, their sacred blood, their rituals, all these were symbols to hold the fragile kingdom together as much as they were signs of personal power. Imagine walking along a forested ridge on a misty morning. The dew weighs on the grass. The river below moves sluggishly, reflecting gray light. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of hammers on shields or the clip-clop of horses is carried faintly by the wind. A king rides slowly through this landscape, hair flowing, bearing both the legacy of Merovingians and the responsibility of countless people. Every decision, every gesture echoes in villages, forests, and towns, shaping the world in subtle, enduring ways. Despite the threats and the occasional battles, there is a remarkable constancy in the Merovingian approach to rule. They understood that power was not merely taken by force. It was nurtured, maintained, and ritualized. Alliances were carefully built, marriages arranged to cement loyalty, religious ceremonies performed to sanctify authority. Warriors trained and prepared, yet their activity was balanced with long periods of waiting, watching, and observing the slow passage of seasons. The dynasty's endurance depended on this mixture of ritual, diplomacy, and readiness, a slow and steady approach that preserved authority through centuries. Even today, when we think of medieval dynasties, we often focus on dramatic events, bloody battles, sudden assassinations, conquests that change borders overnight. But the Merovingians remind us that true power is often quieter, slower. It lies in the repeated patterns of life, the careful timing of alliances, the regular rituals of court, the measured exercise of authority that keeps the kingdom intact even amid uncertainty. Their reign may appear indulgent or mysterious, but it is built on this steady, patient framework, a framework that allowed a relatively small kingdom to survive and influence the shaping of medieval Europe. As night falls across the Merovingian landscape, imagine the soft glow of fires in village homes, the flickering torchlight in wooden halls, and the quiet movement of the king through his court. Outside, the wind rustles leaves, rivers move under the moonlight, and the forest seems still but alive. It is in this rhythm, the intersection of calm and vigilance, myth and reality, that the dynasty sustains itself. Battles are fought, alliances built, power exercised, yet always within the slow, enduring patterns of life that make history move gently, persistently, almost imperceptibly. The Merovingians, with their long hair, sacred blood, and careful navigation of human and natural forces, ruled through both presence and patience. Their story is one of endurance, of subtle influence, of quiet power that extends beyond immediate events. To follow them is to follow a rhythm of life that is at once ordinary and extraordinary, grounded in daily routine yet elevated by legend, a dynasty that shaped the slow, deliberate course of European history. Beyond the forests, villages, and rivers of Merovingian Gaul, there existed another dimension to their power, a dimension that was subtle, often unseen, but deeply felt. This was the realm of the sacred mysteries, the quiet rituals, secret symbols, and whispered stories that lingered in monasteries, halls, and even in the hearts of the kings themselves. To understand the dynasty fully, we must slow down and enter this hidden world, imagining it not in dramatic flashes, but in long, deliberate rhythms that echo through centuries. The Merovingians were rulers of both land and legend. They were tied to the tangible, the forests and rivers, the roads and fields, the feasts and courts, but they were also tied to the intangible. Sacred relics, symbols of divine authority, and secret knowledge were part of the weave of their rule. Some of these objects were known, displayed to remind subjects of the king's sanctity. Others were hidden, carried from one palace to another, preserved in monasteries or private chambers. Scholars and monks later whispered that these relics held knowledge that reached beyond the ordinary world, knowledge that could influence both the living and the dead. Consider the king's hall at twilight. The sky outside is a soft gray, with the first stars beginning to shimmer faintly through the trees. Inside, lamps flicker, casting gentle shadows across wooden walls, tapestries, and banners. A monk, seated quietly in a corner, copies a sacred text, the tip of his quill moving slowly across parchment. Nearby, a chest of relics rests, locked and carefully guarded. These objects, perhaps a cross, a fragment of cloth, or a small carved stone, are not merely decorative. They are symbols, reminders that the king's authority is sanctioned, supported, and strengthened by forces beyond human comprehension. The rituals of the Merovingians were deliberate and slow. Even simple acts, anointing with oil, the blessing of fields, the consecration of a new hall, were extended, measured, and repeated. This was not extravagance for its own sake. It was a rhythm of life designed to reinforce the sacred nature of kingship. Every gesture, every word carried weight. The long hair of the king, the slow folding of hands, the careful placement of candles, all created an atmosphere in which power felt both natural and unassailable. Monasteries played a critical role in preserving these mysteries. Monks lived lives of repetitive devotion, waking before dawn, chanting prayers, copying texts, tending gardens, and keeping records. Yet within these rhythms, they also safeguarded knowledge. Some texts contain maps, genealogies, or chronicles that traced the Merovingian bloodline. Others hinted at spiritual secrets, metaphors, and allegories meant to instruct only the initiated. For the kings, this knowledge was a quiet source of strength, an invisible foundation for rule that could not be measured in armies alone. Even in villages far from the halls of kings, traces of these sacred practices could be felt. Pilgrims carried news of miracles. Monks traveled to bless fields or heal the sick, and festivals blended Christian rituals with older, local traditions. Each act, each repetition, tied the people to the rhythm of the dynasty, to the subtle sense that their lives were part of a larger, enduring story. There was no rush, no immediate spectacle. Instead, a slow, almost imperceptible weaving of influence and authority persisted, one day, one ritual, one story at a time. The Merovingians also understood the power of secrecy. Many chronicles hint at treasures and objects that were never spoken of openly. Some scholars later suggested that these included maps, relics, or writings that might later reach the hands of the Templars. Whether true or not, such stories gave the dynasty an aura of mystery that lasted long after their political power waned. The sense that the kings were keepers of hidden wisdom made them figures not only of authority, but of intrigue, shadows that stretched across centuries. Imagine walking through a Merovingian forest at night. The moon rises slowly, casting silver light across the trees, rivers, and mist. The air smells faintly of pine, wet earth, and wood smoke from distant fires. Somewhere in the distance, the faint chanting of a monk rises and falls, carried softly on the wind. The king rides slowly along a hidden path, hair flowing, perhaps carrying a small chest or simply reflecting upon the sacred responsibilities of his line. Every detail, the rustle of leaves, the soft creak of the horse's saddle, the glimmer of moonlight on armor, contributes to the sense that this is a world of deliberate, quiet power, measured and enduring. Even the smallest ceremonies reinforce this power. The blessing of a newborn, the dedication of a chapel, the presentation of gifts to loyal nobles, all are performed with slow care. Repetition is key. A gesture made once is fleeting, made daily, weekly, seasonally. It accumulates weight, creating continuity that outlasts individual lives. Through these rituals, the Merovingians assert a form of authority that is invisible yet persistent, a subtle current that binds land, people, and legend together. It is in these quiet moments that the dynasty's enduring influence becomes clear. The Merovingians did not rely solely on armies or the threat of force. Their strength lay in ritual, legend, secrecy, and the careful cultivation of loyalty. These were the elements that allowed a relatively small kingdom to persist for centuries, shaping culture, faith, and the slow rhythms of daily life. Through repetition, meditation, and subtle ceremony, kings and monks together created a world that felt stable, ordered, and sacred. And yet, there is always fragility. The forests, rivers, and villages are unpredictable. Alliances shift, heirs quarrel, external threats linger. The sacred objects and rituals provide support, but they cannot fully prevent unrest or disorder. What they do provide is a slow, deliberate framework for survival, a pattern that, if followed carefully, allows continuity and endurance in an uncertain world. As you imagine the kingdom at night, with fires flickering, soft chants echoing through halls, and moonlight touching the river and forests. It becomes clear that the Merovingians were masters of both seen and unseen worlds. Their authority was rooted in tangible power, troops, lands, wealth, but it was sustained and magnified by the quiet, repetitive, sacred rituals that wove together legend, devotion, and governance. Each day, each ceremony, each act of observation contributed to a slow, deliberate assertion of control that lasted generations. The dynasty's mystical aspects, its sacred blood, its long hair, its secret knowledge, did not always manifest dramatically. They worked quietly, invisibly, like roots growing beneath the soil. But through them, the Merovingians left a mark on the medieval world that outlasted their reign. Even as political power shifted to the Carolingians, the memory of these sacred kings persisted, a testament to the enduring influence of ritual, legend, and quiet authority. And so, we reach a point in the Merovingian story where myth, history, and daily life converge. The kings are rulers, yes, but they are also guardians of sacred mysteries, keepers of hidden knowledge, and orchestrators of slow, deliberate rhythms that shape the world. Their power is subtle, persistent, and enduring, echoing in villages, forests, halls, and monasteries alike, leaving traces that historians, pilgrims, and storytellers would uncover for centuries to come. Even as the Merovingians established their authority through legend, ritual, and subtle governance, the dynasty was not immune to the slow creep of decline. Power, after all, is as delicate as it is enduring, and no matter how carefully it is maintained, it is subject to both internal and external pressures. In the later centuries of Merovingian rule, these pressures became increasingly visible. It is here, in the shadows of fading authority and whispered intrigue, that we can most clearly see the human and mystical dimensions of the dynasty. By the 7th century, the Merovingian kings were often described as Roisfanians, or do-nothing kings. While this label suggests laziness, the reality is more complex. Many kings were still surrounded by ceremonies, rituals, and sacred symbols that marked their legitimacy. Their long hair, the relics they carried, and the alliances they maintained continued to give them authority. Yet the practical governance of their kingdoms increasingly fell to their mayors of the palace, advisors, and clerics. The daily work of ruling, the negotiation of alliances, the organization of armies, the collection of tribute, was delegated to others, while the kings preserved the appearance of continuity, the slow rhythm of legitimacy that had always been central to their power. Imagine a royal hall at midday. The light filters softly through narrow windows, illuminating wooden beams and polished floors. The king sits, hair flowing, eyes steady, listening to reports delivered in hushed tones. Advisors move quietly, bearing messages from distant regions. Outside, courtyards are alive with the low murmur of servants, the stamping of horses, and the faint clang of armor as young warriors train. Even as the king seems calm and perhaps distant, every movement, every gesture, every carefully timed word contributes to the delicate balance of authority. Power, after all, is never absolute. It is maintained through perception as much as action. Intrigue became a defining feature of the late Merovingian era. Succession disputes, rivalries among nobles, and the ambitions of powerful mayors of the palace created an atmosphere of tension that was both subtle and pervasive. A misplaced word, a slight insult, or a forgotten ritual could shift loyalties and unravel months or even years of careful governance. Alliances, once cemented by marriage or ceremony, were fragile, subject to the slow erosion of trust or the quiet persuasion of rivals. To the untrained observer, the kingdom might appear orderly. Beneath the surface, however, currents of ambition and suspicion flowed endlessly. Daily life continued to unfold in this context, though with a quiet awareness of instability. Villagers tilled their fields, tended livestock, and maintained the routines that sustained both body and community. Monks chanted in monasteries, copying texts and preserving knowledge. Markets hummed with the slow rhythm of trade. Warriors trained and patrolled, keeping the peace as best they could. And all around, the influence of the Merovingians, both visible and hidden, shaped these patterns. Authority persisted in ritual and symbol, even as practical control shifted elsewhere. The sacred mysteries, too, were affected by this period of decline. Relics, sacred objects, and hidden knowledge were still preserved, but the guardianship of these items grew more complicated. With kings less directly involved in governance, monasteries and advisors assumed greater responsibility for maintaining the spiritual and symbolic foundations of power. Documents were copied meticulously, relics secured, and ceremonies performed with careful repetition. Even as political authority became fragile, the sacred dimension of Merovingian rule continued to assert itself, slow, deliberate, and persistent. Wars and skirmishes also played a role in this era. While major battles were less frequent, regional conflicts, raids, and border disputes required vigilance. Imagine a misty morning along the borders of a Merovingian kingdom. Soldiers assemble quietly, checking weapons and armor, horses stamping in place, banners swaying gently in the light breeze. The air smells of damp earth and wood smoke. There is tension in every measured step, in the careful arrangement of troops. Even small skirmishes are significant, affecting local populations, influencing alliances, and reinforcing the need for careful leadership. As the dynasty weakened, the Carolingians, rising figures of ambition and skill, began to assert themselves. They recognized that while the Merovingians retained sacred authority and symbolic legitimacy, practical control of kingdoms required energy, strategy, and decisive action. Slowly, over decades, power shifted from the long-haired kings to these new rulers, marking the end of an era. Yet the Merovingians did not vanish immediately. They lingered, their presence felt through ritual, tradition, and the memory of their sacred blood. Even the most ordinary aspects of life, food, work, sleep, were shaped by these slow currents of decline. Villagers continued to bake bread, milk cows, and tend fields, often unaware of the subtle shifts in power above them. Children played near streams. Monks chanted softly in the distance, and travelers moved cautiously along roads that still bore traces of Roman construction. Yet these ordinary activities were interwoven with the rhythms of authority, the persistent presence of kings, and the quiet undercurrents of intrigue that defined the late Merovingian period. The tension between appearance and reality is particularly striking. Kings maintained ceremonial presence, their long hair and sacred rituals creating the sense of continuity, even when their practical authority waned. Advisors, mayors of the palace, and powerful nobles managed day-to-day governance, often quietly directing outcomes that seemed to flow from the king himself. This delicate balance of perception and influence is a reminder that power is not always dramatic. It can persist quietly, almost imperceptibly, through symbols, repetition, and the careful cultivation of loyalty. At night, the kingdom feels especially suspended between continuity and change. Fires flicker in village homes and palace halls, shadows dancing across wooden walls. The soft chant of monks drifts through courtyards, mingling with the occasional neigh of horses or rustle of leaves in the wind. Kings sleep beneath blankets of wool, hair long and flowing, dreaming, or perhaps meditating on the persistence of their line. Outside, the forests and rivers endure, carrying secrets, histories, and the quiet rhythms of life forward. Even as the Merovingians fade, their influence persists. The rituals, legends, and sacred mysteries they preserved continue to resonate. The do-nothing kings of later centuries may have been less active politically, yet the dynasty's aura, its slow, enduring authority, remained. Their legacy is a reminder that history is often maintained in subtle, almost imperceptible ways, in ritual, in legend, in the careful weaving of relationships and symbols that sustain authority long after individual lives have passed. And so, the story of the last Merovingians is not one of dramatic collapse alone. It is a story of patience, ritual, and subtle endurance. Power ebbs and flows, alliances shift, intrigue simmers beneath the surface, yet the dynasty's presence lingers in forests, villages, halls, and monasteries. Through ceremony, sacred relics, and the careful exercise of influence, the Merovingians leave traces that will ripple into the centuries, influencing those who come after them, including the enigmatic orders that will rise long after the last long-haired king has passed. Even as the Merovingian dynasty waned, their story did not vanish entirely. The long-haired kings, the sacred relics, the rituals, and the careful weaving of alliances left traces that extended far beyond their immediate reign. These were not traces of armies or battles alone, but traces of secrecy, of quiet influence, and of knowledge preserved and passed down, sometimes deliberately, sometimes inadvertently, through the slow rhythms of everyday life. To follow these traces, we must slow our pace and immerse ourselves in the world of subtle power, quiet devotion, and enduring legend. Imagine, for a moment, a forest at dawn in late Merovingian Gaul. Mist curls between the trees, soft dew weighs down the grass, and the distant murmur of a river mingles with the faint rustle of animals waking. Somewhere along a hidden path, a monk moves quietly, carrying a small chest containing sacred relics. The contents are known only to a few: fragments of cloth, carved symbols, perhaps even a manuscript hinting at knowledge that will only fully emerge centuries later. The monk's movements are deliberate, slow, cautious. Every step matters. Every decision carries the weight of history and secrecy. These hidden objects and documents were more than symbols. They were repositories of influence, connecting past, present, and future. Some contained genealogical records that preserve the memory of Merovec and his descendants. Others may have contained maps, ritual instructions, or allegories meant to guide future rulers, priests, or initiates. In a world where written communication was rare and literacy limited, these objects became powerful conduits of knowledge. They carried authority, reinforced legitimacy, and maintained continuity even as the visible power of kings waned. The Merovingians were also aware of the psychology of secrecy. To rule is not merely to act, it is to be perceived. Sacred relics, hidden texts, and slow, deliberate ceremonies created a sense of presence that extended beyond what one could see. Even as the dynasty's political power diminished, these rituals and objects maintained a quiet aura of influence. Nobles and commoners alike might not witness the ceremonies directly, but stories, rumors, and whispers circulated, preserving the perception of authority. This perception mattered as much as reality, sometimes more, in shaping the allegiance of subjects and the loyalty of allies. Everyday life continued alongside these hidden currents of power. Villagers tilled fields, tended animals, baked bread, and maintained homes. Monks copied manuscripts, chanted prayers, and cared for the sick. Children played along streams and hedgerows, their laughter mingling with the faint echoes of distant rituals. Warriors trained and patrolled, ensuring that the kingdom's rhythms of security and stability persisted. In all these ordinary actions, the subtle threads of Merovingian influence were woven through ritual, legend, and secret knowledge into the fabric of daily existence. It is in this context that we can begin to see the connections to the future. Centuries after the last Merovingian king, whispers of hidden treasures, sacred relics, and mysterious manuscripts influenced the imaginations of later orders, including the Templars. Whether through oral tradition, copied texts, or carefully preserved objects, certain patterns of secrecy and ritual persisted, echoing through time. The Merovingians, in effect, became custodians not just of kingdoms, but of long-enduring mysteries, their influence reaching beyond the political landscape into realms of legend and spiritual authority. Consider a late evening in a quiet Merovingian monastery. The sky is dark. The moon casts a pale glow across cloisters and courtyards, and the only sounds are the rustle of robes, the soft tapping of quills on parchment, and the faint murmur of chanting. A monk pauses to glance at a small chest tucked beneath a table. The relics inside are silent witnesses to centuries of rule, carefully preserved knowledge, and deliberate ritual. They will be carried forward, hidden from the world, yet potent in their influence. Every gesture, the closing of the chest, the soft step away, the repetition of a prayer, reinforces continuity. It is a slow, measured assertion of the dynasty's presence beyond armies, beyond politics, beyond time. Even the landscape itself seems to participate in the persistence of these secrets. Forests hide paths known only to a few. Rivers carry messages across distant regions, and mountains or hills provide natural fortifications for the careful transport of treasures. Travelers, pilgrims, and messengers move cautiously, guided by knowledge that may have originated in Merovingian rituals or records. This is not dramatic adventure. It is the slow, deliberate movement of information and influence, measured and methodical, almost imperceptible to those outside the inner circles. The subtle interplay between secrecy and daily life is particularly striking. Ordinary villagers may never know of the relics or manuscripts, yet their routines, gathering at markets, observing festivals, participating in church services, intersect with the rhythms of Merovingian authority. Every communal gathering, every prayer, every festival contributes to an environment in which authority, sacred or otherwise, persists. The dynasty's hidden influence is embedded in the mundane as well as the ceremonial, creating a multi-layered presence that lasts long after kings have passed. Stories of the Merovingians' hidden knowledge, sacred objects, and mysterious rituals persisted in the centuries that followed. Some of these stories were whispered by monks, recorded in chronicles, or hinted at in genealogies. They were not meant to be fully understood by all. They were carefully curated, shared only with those deemed trustworthy. Yet over time, these whispers contributed to legends that would inspire fascination, speculation, and study long after the dynasty itself faded from power. The dynasty's aura became a thread connecting past to future, history to myth, the seen to the unseen. Imagine walking along a moonlit path through a quiet village or forest centuries later. Perhaps you hear the faint echo of a chant, the rustle of a hidden chest being opened, or the flicker of candlelight in a distant hall. The Merovingians themselves are gone, yet their influence persists in these quiet, almost imperceptible ways. It is the rhythm of secrecy, ritual, and deliberate continuity that survives. The careful placement of objects, the repetition of stories, the preservation of knowledge. These echoes ripple through time, shaping the imaginations of future generations, leaving a trace of authority, mystique, and endurance. The dynasty's impact is not measured solely in political achievements or battles won. It is measured in the slow, persistent shaping of culture, ritual, and legend. Through meticulous attention to sacred symbols, careful preservation of knowledge, and deliberate control of perception, the Merovingians created a legacy that would reverberate long after their rule ended. Even as the Carolingians assumed political control, the long-haired kings continued to shape European consciousness through myth, ritual, and the hidden mysteries they preserved. And so, the story of the Merovingians is not simply one of kings and kingdoms. It is a story of secrets carefully kept, rituals deliberately performed, and influence extended beyond the visible realm of power. By observing the rhythms of daily life, the subtle movements of clergy and nobles, and the preservation of sacred objects and manuscripts, we begin to understand how a dynasty, even in decline, can leave a footprint that echoes through the centuries. It is a footprint of quiet endurance, deliberate ritual, and almost imperceptible, yet persistent, authority, a legacy that blends history, myth, and the enduring power of secrecy. Even as the last long-haired kings faded from the political landscape, their influence continued to ripple across Europe, subtle, quiet, and enduring. The Merovingians had not ruled merely through armies or courts, but through rituals, legends, sacred relics, and the careful preservation of knowledge, all of which persisted long after their dynasty formally ended. To fully grasp this hidden legacy, one must move slowly through the landscapes, towns, and monasteries of early medieval Europe, imagining the echoes of a dynasty that shaped history in ways both visible and invisible. Imagine walking along a riverbank at dawn in northern Gaul. Mist curls lazily over the water, dew weighs down the grass, and birds call softly in the distance. In the nearby village, the smell of freshly baked bread drifts from ovens, while the faint sound of a monk chanting rises from a monastery tucked among the trees. Somewhere along a hidden path, a messenger carries a small chest of relics or documents, careful not to alert the uninitiated. Each step, each movement, each gesture is deliberate, slow, and measured, reflecting the enduring influence of the Merovingians' sacred and political authority. The dynasty's hidden legacy was built on continuity and subtlety. Even as Carolingians rose to political prominence, they inherited a world shaped by Merovingian precedents. Laws, customs, and territorial organization reflected the influence of long-haired kings. Sacred relics and manuscripts, preserved in monasteries and private collections, carried teachings, genealogies, and rituals that subtly guided later rulers and clerics. These objects acted as conduits of authority, ensuring that the Merovingians' presence extended far beyond their reign. Daily life across Europe continued to unfold in rhythm with these influences. Villagers worked the land, milked livestock, baked bread, and maintained homes. Monks copied texts, tended sick travelers, and offered prayers for rulers and communities alike. Soldiers trained along the borders, watching for raids, and nobles maintained ceremonial courts. Even without knowing the details of Merovingian power, ordinary people participated unknowingly in a culture shaped by centuries of ritual, legend, and quiet authority. The rhythm of life itself carried traces of the dynasty's legacy. Particularly important were rituals and festivals, which blended Merovingian practices with Christian observances. Pilgrims traveled to abbeys where sacred relics had been preserved, unaware of their historical origins. Bishops and priests incorporated older traditions into sermons, blessings, and processions, creating continuity between past and present. Even as political control shifted, the influence of sacred authority persisted, quietly reinforcing societal cohesion and cultural memory. The Merovingians' hidden knowledge was also preserved in manuscripts and chronicles. Some texts recorded genealogies, linking kings to semi-legendary ancestors like Merovech. Others contained allegories, metaphors, or instructions for ritual and governance, intended for the eyes of trusted scribes or clerics. These documents traveled slowly across regions, copied meticulously in monasteries, and sometimes carried to distant courts. Through this preservation, knowledge and influence persisted, creating an intellectual and spiritual thread that connected centuries of European history. Wars and political transitions continued, yet the Merovingians' subtle influence remained. Even when Carolingians or other rulers commanded armies, their authority was shaped by inherited traditions of sacred kingship, ritual, and symbol. Soldiers trained and marched in patterns echoing past practices. Nobles negotiated alliances using precedents established by long-haired kings, and clergy continued ceremonies that reinforced continuity and legitimacy. History, in this sense, was a river flowing steadily, carrying remnants of Merovingian power along its course. Imagine the late evening in a monastery centuries after the last Merovingian king. Candlelight flickers across stone walls, illuminating manuscripts carefully stored on wooden shelves. The faint rustle of robes accompanies soft chanting, blending with the distant sound of water flowing through cloisters. A monk pauses to examine a small relic, contemplating its origin and significance. Though the dynasty has ended, its influence persists in these quiet, deliberate acts, shaping thought, belief, and governance across generations. Even in the secular world, traces remain. Place names, legal practices, and territorial boundaries reflect Merovingian influence. Roads, fortifications, and settlements that were maintained or established during the dynasty continued to guide movement, commerce, and communication. Nobles who served or descended from Merovingian loyalists preserved traditions, alliances, and rituals, extending the dynasty's influence beyond its political lifespan. History, in this way, is never erased. It is layered, persistent, and slow to fade. The subtlety of Merovingian influence is crucial. It was not always dramatic or obvious. There were no grand proclamations or monumental victories marking this legacy. Instead, it persisted through ritual, repetition, and careful preservation of knowledge. Ordinary people, distant from the courts and palaces, absorbed its influence unknowingly through stories, ceremonies, festivals, and habits. The dynasty shaped consciousness, culture, and governance in ways almost imperceptible yet enduring, a testament to the quiet power of long-term continuity. The dynasty's sacred secrets, preserved in hidden relics and manuscripts, would later inspire myths and legends, including the mysterious orders and societies that followed. Whispers of treasures, sacred bloodlines, and mystical knowledge circulated for centuries, linking Merovingians to the imaginations of future generations. The dynasty's presence persisted not just in history books, but in the cultural and spiritual consciousness of Europe long after their political authority ended. Imagine walking through a European village at night, centuries after the last king. The moon rises slowly, casting silver light across cobblestone streets and riverbanks. A faint chant drifts from the monastery, mingling with the smell of smoke and damp earth. Somewhere, a hidden manuscript or relic is carefully preserved, its origins almost forgotten, yet silently influential. These traces remind us that history is not only in battles, laws, or political deeds. It is also in quiet, deliberate acts, carefully preserved, slowly shaping the world. Even as time passes, the Merovingians' hidden legacy shapes perception, ritual, and cultural memory. Their long hair, sacred blood, and secret knowledge provided legitimacy to rulers, continuity to communities, and a quiet rhythm to daily life. Though often overlooked, these aspects of power endured, influencing governance, spirituality, and societal structure across Europe. In every chant, every ritual, every carefully copied manuscript, their presence lingers, subtle yet persistent. And so, the story of the Merovingians does not end with the last king or the fall of dynastic power. It is a story of hidden legacy, careful preservation, and enduring influence. Through ritual, secrecy, and deliberate repetition, the dynasty's power continued to echo long after the long-haired kings themselves were gone. It is a legacy of subtle endurance, a quiet rhythm that bridges history and legend, visible only to those who look carefully, listen patiently, and follow the slow currents of influence through time. As we draw near the end of this journey through Merovingian history, it becomes clear that their story is unlike the dramatic tales of conquests and epic battles that dominate history books. Instead, it is a story of subtlety, rhythm, and endurance, a story that unfolds slowly, quietly, and deliberately, much like the soft turning of the seasons or the gentle rise of the moon over a misty forest. To understand the Merovingians fully, one must embrace patience, notice the quiet rhythms, and attend to the seemingly ordinary acts that carried extraordinary significance. Even after the last long-haired king passed from the political stage, the echoes of their presence persisted. These echoes are not loud or boisterous. They are soft, deliberate, and almost imperceptible, carried in rituals, sacred relics, manuscripts, genealogies, and the quiet habits of ordinary life. Imagine a small village in Gaul, centuries after the decline of the Merovingians. Smoke drifts lazily from thatched roofs. Children's laughter echoes from the fields, and monks chant softly in a distant abbey. The streets are quiet, yet in the subtle rhythm of daily life, in the cycles of prayer and labor, in the slow repetition of festivals and blessings, the legacy of the Merovingians lingers like a faint, persistent melody. Consider the sacred relics and manuscripts that were meticulously preserved. A monk, by candlelight, opens a small chest, careful not to disturb the order of centuries. Inside are fragments of cloth, tiny carved symbols, and pages of text whose meanings are known only to the few entrusted with their care. These objects, seemingly inert, carry power, the power of continuity, the power of ritual, and the power of memory. They link past and present, reminding those who encounter them that history is not only in visible events, but in the careful preservation of knowledge, the deliberate repetition of ritual, and the soft but persistent assertion of authority. Even in ordinary spaces, the Merovingians' influence subtly persists. Villagers gather for markets and festivals, tending to their fields, animals, and homes. Monks continue copying texts and chanting prayers. Soldiers patrol quietly along boundaries, maintaining order. Nobles perform ceremonies, carefully following inherited traditions. Every action, repeated across generations, is part of a rhythm that traces back to the long-haired kings. Authority, in this sense, is not always obvious. It is woven into the texture of daily life, experienced in repetition, ritual, and quiet observance rather than in public spectacle. The Merovingians' hidden knowledge also extends beyond the physical world. Whispers of sacred bloodlines, mysterious treasures, and cryptic manuscripts persisted in stories and oral traditions, influencing later orders, including the Templars. These echoes of the past shaped imagination, devotion, and governance long after the dynasty's political authority faded. Even when rulers changed, when new dynasties rose and fell, the underlying framework, the rituals, symbols, and sacred precedents, continued to guide behavior, belief, and perception. Let us slow down further and imagine a night in a small European town. The moon rises softly, casting silver light across cobblestones, rooftops, and quiet rivers. A soft breeze rustles the leaves of nearby trees. From a distant abbey, the faint murmur of chanting drifts into the night. Somewhere in a hidden chamber, a manuscript lies open, carefully preserved by a monk who has dedicated their life to protecting knowledge. Though centuries have passed, the influence of the Merovingians is still present in these deliberate, measured acts. The rhythm of history continues, quietly echoing the dynasty's presence, long after the last king's hair was cut. This enduring whisper is a testament to the subtlety and foresight of the Merovingians. They understood that authority is not only exercised through armies and decrees, but through ritual, repetition, secrecy, and the careful cultivation of perception. Long hair, sacred relics, ceremonial practices, and hidden manuscripts were tools not just of symbolic legitimacy, but of enduring influence. The dynasty's true power was slow, deliberate, and almost invisible, yet it persisted far longer than many more outwardly forceful rulers. Even the landscapes of Europe retained traces of Merovingian influence. Roads, bridges, fortifications, and settlements that were maintained or established during the dynasty continued to guide commerce, communication, and daily life. Legal customs, religious observances, and territorial boundaries reflected patterns established under Merovingian rule. Each step across a familiar path, each participation in ritual, each observance of inherited law is a quiet reminder of the dynasty's enduring presence. History, in this sense, is not erased. It accumulates, layer upon layer, like sediment slowly building along the banks of a river. The story of the Merovingians also teaches us the importance of perception. Even kings who were considered do-nothing maintained authority through subtle, deliberate acts. Advisors, clerics, and nobles carried much of the administrative work, but the ceremonial presence of the king, the sacred rituals, and the symbolic objects reinforced legitimacy. Authority, therefore, is not simply about action. It is about rhythm, presence, and the deliberate cultivation of continuity over time. By contemplating the Merovingians' hidden legacies, we see that power and influence can be quiet yet enduring. It is not always measured in battles or conquests, but in the careful preservation of knowledge, in the repetition of ritual, in the maintenance of perception, and in the subtle shaping of culture and belief. This is a type of history that unfolds slowly, almost imperceptibly, requiring patience and attention to fully appreciate. As you drift further into thought, imagine the gentle unfolding of centuries. Monasteries rise and fall, kings come and go, villages expand and shrink. Yet in the quiet repetition of ritual, the careful copying of manuscripts, and the deliberate preservation of sacred relics, the whispers of the Merovingians persist. They are a reminder that history is not only the visible accumulation of events, but also the slow, deliberate layering of influence, secrecy, and continuity that shapes civilizations across generations. Finally, consider the human aspect of this story. Kings, monks, nobles, and villagers all participated in a rhythm that extended far beyond their own lifetimes. Every gesture, every chant, every carefully preserved object contributed to a pattern that stretched across Europe and through centuries. In this way, the Merovingians' legacy is both temporal and spiritual, grounded in daily life and elevated in ritual, influencing generations long after the last long-haired king passed from memory. And so, as we close this exploration, we are left with a sense of quiet continuity, a rhythm that is slow, deliberate, and enduring. The Merovingians may have vanished from political power, but their presence, preserved through ritual, secrecy, and careful attention to legacy, continues to echo. In forests, monasteries, villages, and the hearts of those who study their story, The dynasty whispers still, a soft, deliberate reminder that influence can endure long after the visible structures of power have faded.